We are at chapter 10. The road neared the ocean, and the woods on either side gradually moved closer and closer as fertile tilled fields grew way to dense forest country. It was the sort of country where peaceful travellers might well become fearful of bandits, as the thick trees close to the roadside gave ample cover for an ambush. Holt, however, had no such fears. In fact, his mood was so dark that he might well have welcomed an attempt by bandits to rob him of his few belongings. His heavy sex knife and throwing knife were easy to hand under his cloak, and he carried his longbow strung resting across the pommel of his saddle. In ranger's fashion, one corner of his cloak, specially made for the purpose, folded back from his shoulders, leaving the feathered ends of the 24 arrows in his quiver within quick, unimpeded reach. It was said that each ranger carried the lives of 24 men in his quiver. Such was their uncanny, deadly accuracy with the longbow. Aside from those obvious weapons and his own finely honed instinct for danger, Holt had two other not so obvious advantages over any potential attacker. The two ranger horses, Tug and Albert, were trained to give quiet warnings of the presence of any strangers that they sensed, and now as Holt rode, Albert's ears twitched several times, and he and Tug both tossed their heads and snorted. Holt reached forward and patted his horse's neck gently. "Good boys," he said softly to the two stocky little horses, and their ears were twitched in recognition of his words. To any observer, the cloak rider was merely quietening his mount, a perfectly normal turn of events. In fact, his senses were heightened and his mind was racing. He spoke again, one word: "Where?" Albert's head angled slightly to the left, pointing towards a copse of trees closest to the road than the rest, some 50 meters further on. Holt glanced quickly over his shoulders and noted that Tug, trotting quietly behind him, was looking in the same direction. Both horses had sensed the presence of strangers, or perhaps a stranger in the trees. Now Holt spoke again: "Release," and the two horses, knowing that their warning had been taken and the direction noted, turned their heads back from the direction they had indicated. It was this sort of specialized skill that gave rangers their uncanny capacity for survival and for anticipating trouble. Still, apparently totally unaware of the presence of anyone in the trees, Holt rode forward at the same relaxed pace. He smiled grimly to himself as he considered the fact that the horse could only tell him that someone was there. They could not foretell that person's intentions or whether or not he was an enemy. That would be supernatural power indeed, he thought to himself. He was 40 meters from the trees now. There were half a dozen of them, bushy and surrounded by heavy undergrowth. They afforded perfect cover for an ambush, or, he reasoned, for someone who simply wanted shelter from the soft rain that had fallen for the past 10 hours or so. From beneath the cowl of his hood, shaded and invisible to any observer, Holt's eyes darted and searched into the thick cover. Albert, closer now to the potential danger, let go a deep-throated grunting sound. It was barely audible, and was felt by his rider more as a rumbling vibration in the horse's barrel chest than anything else. Holt nudged him with one knee. "I know," he said softly, knowing the shadow of his cowl would hide any movement of his lips. This was close enough, he decided. His bow gave him the advantage as long as he stayed at a distance. He tweaked the reins gently, and Albert halted, Tug taking one more pace before he too came to a stop. With an easy, fluid motion, Holt reached for an arrow from his quiver and knocked it to the string of his bow. He made no attempt to draw the bow. Years of constant practice made him capable of drawing, aiming, firing, and hitting in the blink of an eye. "I like to see you in the open," he called in a carrying voice. There was a moment's hesitation, then a heavy-set, mounted figure spurred forward from the trees, coming to a halt on clear ground at the verge of the road. A warrior, Holt saw, nothing the dull gleam of chainmail at his arms and around his neck. He wore a cloak as well, to keep the rain off. A simple conical steel helmet was slung on his saddle bow, and a round blazoned buckle was slung at his back. Holt could see no sign of a sword or other weapon, but he reasoned that such would most likely be worn on the man's left side, this side furthest away from him. It was safe to assume that the rider would be carrying a weapon of some kind. After all, there was no point in wearing half armor and going weaponless. There was something familiar about the figure, however. A moment more and Holt recognized the rider. He relaxed, replacing the arrow in his quiver with the same smooth, practiced movement. He urged Albert forward and rode to greet the other rider. "What are you doing here?" he asked, already having a pretty good idea what the answer was going to be. "I'm coming with you," said Horace, confirming what Holt had suspected. "You're going to find Will, and I want to join you." "I see," Holt said, drawing reins as he came alongside the youth. Horace was a tall boy, and his battle's horse stood several hands higher than Albert. The ranger found himself having to look up at the young face. It was set in determined lines, he noted. "And what do you think your apprentice master will have to say about that when he finds out?" he asked. "Sir Rodney," Horace shrugged. "He knows already. I told him I was leaving." Holt inclined his head in some surprise. He'd expected that Horace would have simply run away in his attempt to join him, but the apprentice warrior was a straightforward type, not given to guile or subterfuge. It was not in Horace's character to simply run off, he realized. And how did he greet his momentous news? Horace frowned, not understanding. "Pardon?" he asked uncertainly, and Holt sighed quietly. "What did he say when you told him? I assume he gave you a good clobber over the ear." Rodney wasn't known for his tolerance of disobedient apprentices. He had a quick temper, and the boys in battle school often felt the full force of it. "No," Horace answered stolidly. "He said to give you a message." Holt shook his head in wonder. "And the message was?" he prompted, and noted that Horace shifted uncomfortably in his saddle before answering. "He said, 'Good luck to you,'" the boy replied finally, "and he said to tell you that I came with his approval, unofficial, of course." "Of course," Holt replied, successfully masking the surprise he felt at this unexpected gesture of support from the battle school commander. "He could hardly give you official approval to go running off with a banished criminal, could he?" Horace thought about that and nodded. "I suppose not," he replied. "So you let me come with you?" Holt shook his head. "Of course I won't," he said briskly. "I don't have time to look after you where I'm going." The boy's face flushed with anger at Holt's dismissive tone. "Sir Rodney also said to tell you that you could possibly use a sword to guard your back on your travels," he said. Holt regarded the tall boy carefully as he spoke. "Those were his next words?" he asked, and Horace shook his head. "Not exactly." "Then tell me exactly what he said," Holt demanded. Horace took a deep breath. "His exact words were, 'You could use a good sword to guard your back.'" Holt hid a smile. "Meaning who?" he challenged. Horace sat his horse flushing furiously, and didn't answer. It was the best reply he could have made. Holt was watching him closely. He didn't take Rodney's recommendation lightly, and he knew that the boy had courage to spare. He'd proven that when he challenged Morgarth to single combat at the plains of Uthal. But there was the chance that he might have become boastful and overconfident, that too much adulation and praise had turned his head. If that were the case, however, he would have answered Holt's sarcastic challenge immediately. The fact that he hadn't, but merely sat in front of him, face set in determined lines, said a lot about the boy's character. Strange how they turn out, Holt thought. He remembered Horace as somewhat of a bully when he'd been younger. Obviously, battle school discipline and a few years' maturity had wrought some interesting changes. He considered the boy again. Truth be told, it would be handy to have a companion along. He'd refused Gillen because he knew the other ranger was needed here in Arlen, but Horace was a different matter. His craftsmaster had given permission, unofficially. He was a more than capable swordsman. He was loyal, and he was dependable. And besides, Holt had to admit that since Will had been taken prisoner, he'd missed having someone younger around him. He missed the excitement and the eagerness that came with young people, and God help him, he'd even missed the endless questions that came with them as well. He realized now that Horace was regarding him anxiously. The boy had been waiting for a decision, and so far he had received nothing more than Holt's sardonic challenge as to the identity of the good sword suggested by Sir Rodney. He sighed heavily and let a savage frown crease his brow. I suppose you'll bombard me with questions day and night, he said. Harrison's shoulders slumped at the tone of voice. Then suddenly he understood the meaning of the words. His face shone and his shoulders lifted again. You mean you'll take me, he said, excitement cracking his voice into a higher register than he intended. Holt looked down and adjusted a strap on his saddle bag that required no adjustment at all. It wouldn't do to tell the boy see the slight smile that was crashing his withered face. It seems I have to, he said reluctantly. You can hardly go back to Sir Rodney now you've run away, can you? No, I can't. I mean, that's wonderful. Thanks, Holt. You won't regret it. I promise. I promise. It's just that I sort of promised myself that I'd find Will and help rescue him. The boy was fairly babbling in his pleasure at being accepted. Holt nudged Albert with his knee and began to ride on, Tug following easily. Hurst urged his battle horse to fall into step with Holt, and continued his flow of gratitude. I knew you'd go after him, Holt. I knew. That's why you pretended to be angry with King Duncan. Nobody at Redmond could believe it when we heard what had happened, but I knew it was so you could go and rescue Will from the Canadians. Enough, Holt said finally, holding up a hand to ward off the flow of words, and Horace stopped in mid-sentence, bowing his head apologetically. Yes, of course, sorry. Not another word, he said. Holt nodded thankfully. I should think not. Chastened, Horace rode in silence beside his new master as they headed towards the east coast. They had gone another 100 meters when he finally could stand it no more. Where will we find a ship? He asked. Will we sail directly to Scandinavia after the raiders? Can we cross the sea at this time of year? Holt turned in the saddle and cast a baleful eye on the young man. It seems it started already, he said heavily, but inside his heart felt lighter than it had for weeks. Oh, that is so nice. Oh my gosh. Okay, well, thank you for listening to me read chapter 10. If you'd like to listen to me read chapter 11 on this page, then please stay posted, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.